From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Chung, and this matters. Supporters of democracies, and in particular American democracy, often cite the peaceful transfer of power, with presidential candidates accepting the results of an election as one of its strengths. It's what separates them from, say, an authoritarian state. But what if U.S. President Donald Trump loses the upcoming election and he refuses to leave the White House? We're not saying that Trump won't accept the election results if he loses. He's the one saying it himself. Here he is during a White House press conference on September 23rd, being questioned by a reporter.
Will you commit to making sure that there is a peaceful transferal of power after the election?
Well, we're going to have to see what happens. You know that I've been complaining very strongly about the ballots, and the ballots are a disaster.
I understand that, but people are rioting.
Get rid of the ballots and you'll have a very peaceful, there won't be a transfer, frankly. There'll be a continuation.
And here's Trump again during the Republican National Convention.
We're going to win this election. The only way they can take this election away from us is if this is a rigged election.
Trump has continued to claim voter fraud based on no evidence after losing the popular vote by nearly 3 million ballots in the 2016 election. And remember, he won that election. What will Trump do if the 2020 election results are anything other than a landslide in his favor?
That's sort of what the experts I talked to, that was their concern, was that we haven't really had someone who has used rhetoric like this before in terms of potentially denying, disputing, however you want to put it, an election result, and might be willing to try to use some of the tools at his disposal as president of the United States.
That's Geoffrey Skelley, the elections analyst for FiveThirtyEight, the data and analytics-driven site on U.S. politics. He's researched and written about how this fall could play out. We're talking about how an incumbent could dispute the election, how far he might be willing to go, and what legal checks and balances the U.S. has to make sure the winner becomes president. Geoffrey, it's good to talk to you.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
So, we don't really have a crystal ball. We don't know who's going to win the 2020 U.S. election. But what kinds of things are we seeing and hearing that tells us that this election is really like no other that we've ever seen before in modern U.S. history?
Sure. I mean, I think you have to start with the COVID situation, with the coronavirus, and how that has thrown the administration of this election for a loop. And I think that has created a level of uncertainty that when you add in rhetoric from, say, President Trump, talking about how he can only lose if it's a rigged election, where he talks about mail balloting, which is an important part of trying to handle concerns about the coronavirus and safely voting, when he calls voting by mail an easy way to rig the election when all evidence about voter fraud, election fraud, would generally run counter to what he's saying. That sort of rhetoric, I think, has created a situation where we just don't know what's going to happen. And that uncertainty, I think, scares a lot of people, understandably, and has, yes, created an election really unlike any other.
And, Trump obviously tweets a lot, but he tweeted on June 22nd, among many other tweets that he has had about mail-in ballots, he said, "Rigged 2020 election, millions of mail-in ballots will be printed by foreign countries and others. It will be the scandal of our times." Obviously, providing no evidence that is the case. Election observers don't think that there's any factual information in that. But I think it's worth kind of stepping back too, that this is completely beyond what other presidents or president incumbents have ever done before, right?
Yeah, there's really no comparison to what the sorts of things that President Trump has said. The United States has certainly had highly disputed elections before, but the sort of rhetoric that you heard was not where someone was essentially saying that they would deny the election result or dispute it in the sense of saying the election is rigged ahead of time. That's just not something that we are familiar with in the U.S., at least in modern times. I mean, I'm sure if you went back to the 19th century, there might be some interesting comparisons. And there have certainly been elections where U.S. history, maybe at lower levels of office, say for gubernatorial elections in some states where you've had incumbent governors try to hold on to power. There were some examples in the 19th century of basically trying to rig the election result so it worked out for them. But in modern times, there really isn't a parallel. So that's, I think, the main challenge with this election is you have an incumbent president who is behaving in a way that no one has before. And this also maybe gets into some struggles that the media has had with covering President Trump, is that the media's default is to cover a president as they have covered past presidents. And at the same time, when you have a president who behaves in a way that previous presidents haven't behaved, and you could give lots of examples in a lot of different areas where that's the case, some of them negative for President Trump, obviously, and then others of them kind of, I think neutral. There's not really they're just different. The bias toward trying to cover him as a normal president, though, I think makes conversations about President Trump saying things like, the election will be rigged if I lose, makes it difficult because that's not normal and you can't cover it as if it's normal.
Right. We can't treat these statements as, oh, this is something that's regularly done. That is, in fact, giving bias to the things that he is saying, which, again, often have been proven to be lies, to be false, or shifting of the truth. This is not a normal time. That is worth saying.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's exactly right. We're looking at trying to hold an election in a difficult situation, and a lot of people are going to vote by mail, and vote by mail is not some pernicious evil that leads to rigged elections. Like, there's many states have been holding elections that are all vote by mail or partially vote by mail for years now. There's no reason to think that it is, it's just so much more vulnerable than election day voting that it's going to create a rigged election. Like, there's no reason to think that.
One of the hallmarks of American democracy is the peaceful transition of power, that no matter how bitter the contest, and there have been really bitter elections in the past, that the loser of the election always concedes to the winner, no matter how tough it is. And this, I guess, brings us to the central question of this conversation is, what if Trump loses and he refuses to concede?
I think it comes down to a question of whether or not President Trump is going to try to use tools at his disposal as president that past presidents have not tried to use to their benefit. Things that come to mind are certain powers of the executive. The fact that at the end of the day, the Department of Justice is essentially his Department of Justice. Nowadays, there really is no independence, maybe, in the Department of Justice, or at least there's less than there once was. And you have Attorney General William Barr saying that an election with a large-scale use of mail balloting, vote by mail, will be very vulnerable to fraud. I mean, the Attorney General is saying those sorts of things and that it could lead to a contested election. When you have that situation, it raises the specter of, well, could President Trump ask the Attorney General and the Department of Justice to send out federal agents to try to interfere, even shut down vote counting after Election Day? Because the real challenge here is that the United States, we tend to know who's won on election night unless the election is extremely close. And there's a traditional expectation for knowing who won on election night. And it's just pretty unlikely this year that that's going to be the case because while there will be plenty of election day votes, you're going to have a huge percentage of voters. I mean, it could be a majority of the people who vote in this election who vote early in some fashion, whether it's by mail or in person before Election Day in states around the country. So you're going to have a ton of votes that are going to still be counted, and there's some states that don't really have much history with absentee voting or vote by mail. And the fact that they're not used to having to handle large-scale mail balloting means that it's going to be a slower process for them. And some of those are key swing states like Pennsylvania or Michigan or Wisconsin. They just don't have much tradition with this. And so most people have usually voted in person on Election Day. And now they have to count a much larger scale of mail ballots, and that's just going to slow the countdown. And the Secretary of State in Michigan, who's in charge of elections there, has said that she doesn't expect them to have counted all the votes until maybe Friday after the election. So, it's going to take a little time for this process to play out in the states. And that's not inherently a problem because at the end of the day, the states usually certify their election results 3 to 4 weeks after the election, depending on the state, depending on state rules. Federalism. Canadians are familiar with this. We have, different rules in each state to some extent on how this process is handled. So that's not inherently a problem, also because it's not until December 8th that the states have to have everything finalized anyway. So they have about a month to have everything sorted out before you get into the Electoral College process, where the electors from each state are chosen by the result in that state. And, the Electoral College is a very confusing thing, I think, for people who may not be Americans. I mean, it's confusing to a lot of Americans, too, fundamentally. But the popular vote itself nationally does not decide the election, but the popular vote in each state decides the electors from each state, and the electors are the total number of U.S. senators and U.S. House of Representatives members from each state. So say Virginia, my home state, there are 2 senators and there are 11 members of the U.S. House, and so it has 13 total votes, and the winner of Virginia will get its 13 electoral votes in the Electoral College, and you need 270, a majority, at a minimum, to win in the Electoral College, because there are 538 total votes, which is why the name of the website I work for is FiveThirtyEight.com. Yeah, so that all connects. But the long and short is that the concern is making sure that all the states have counted their votes and have worked out any controversies over those vote totals, any disputes, by December 8th, because that is the date by law that they have to have all that figured out, so that the electors can then vote on December 14th in their respective states. And so they've got time to figure this out in terms of the count and whatnot. So a slow count is not a sign of a problem. It's a sign of an election where a bunch of states are going to have a lot more ballots to count that were cast by mail. But at the same time, you have rhetoric from people like the president trying to sort of cast that slowness as an inherent problem, a sign of rigging, a sign of fraud, a sign of some sort of problem. And that's highly disconcerting because of just what it does to faith in the electoral process. And you see this in polls where majorities of Americans aren't confident that the election is going to be handled in a fair and equal way. And so that then, I think, creates an opportunity for people who are trying to discredit the electoral process. It's fertile ground to discredit it because of all this.
Right. And so there's also already, like you're saying, there's a degree of uncertainty in the way we normally see election night. Normally that evening, the U.S. population knows who their president will be. Just because of mail-in ballots, counting, the pandemic, everything that's going on, that's probably not going to be likely, right? So there's already that embedded, is what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. There's just doubt and uncertainty about so many things, and the election is a part of that because of what's been going on with the coronavirus. And a lot more people are planning to vote by mail to stay safe. And what's also happened that I think is important in this, though, is that because of the president's rhetoric, I mean, we can't know 100% for sure it's the president's rhetoric, but it's pretty easy to hypothesize that that's what it is. You see also a very large partisan split between how people plan to vote, like what method they're going to choose. And in the past, that wasn't the case. In the past, there wasn't really much of a split in terms of how Democrats and Republicans, how likely they were to vote by mail, to vote early in person, or to vote like normally in person on an election day. Like that, you didn't see differences. But this year you see these huge splits where maybe a poll will say 50% of Democrats are planning to vote by mail, but only like 25% of Republicans are planning to vote by mail. And so then when you're thinking about the counting process, I mean, look, we have polls showing Joe Biden's ahead. Joe Biden is not certain to win the election by any means. Our own forecast gives him about a 3 in 4 shot of winning. That's not statistically certain by any means. But what could happen is that on election night, President Trump could be ahead based on the votes that have been counted in a lot of key swing states because they haven't counted all the mail ballots yet. Now, each state does counting a little differently in terms of what they count first. We can't know exactly how that's all going to play out. But I think given the fact that Republicans are much more likely to vote on election day proper, it would not surprise me that if in a state like Pennsylvania, President Trump was leading by, 10 percentage points on election night or something. And then because hundreds of thousands of votes were still being counted that were cast by mail and they were very disproportionately Democratic, that lead would disappear over the next few days as they finish the counting process. But that, of course, leads to claims like President Trump has tweeted things about the election needs to be decided on election night. We need to know who won on election night. And so that, again, getting back to sort of discrediting the electoral process, that's where I think a lot of this concern comes from.
The groundwork is already being laid by him Geoffrey, you spoke to the Transition Integrity Project, and that's a bipartisan research group of over 100 academics, journalists, government campaign officials, polling experts, and they came up with different scenarios on how this could all play out if Trump disputes the election or if he loses. What do those scenarios and those simulations tell us about how this could play out?
Well, Rosa Brooks, who was the co-founder of this group, she's a law professor at Georgetown University. She sort of summed it up for me in that no matter what happens with this election, she felt reasonably confident that it was going to be contested in some way. Like there will be litigation. It's just sort of a question of to what degree, and then beyond litigation, what else might happen in a potential electoral dispute, and so it's sort of a question of low level or a lot more than low level.
For the political nerds listening, and that's speaking as a political nerd, Geoffrey gets deep into the different simulations at a state level, at an electoral college level, how the Constitution can get wrapped up in what would be a full-blown legal battle. You can find all of that in the 538 extended cut of this episode on the This Matters podcast feed. Just scroll to this point of that episode, and we'll pick up right where we left off. Trust me, it's fascinating stuff. But if you want to skip all of that, no worries. Just keep listening right here. We'll be right back. So there is a scenario where January 20th, that is when the new term starts, whoever wins, and it's entirely possible that two men could show up in Washington to be sworn in. That is a possibility that could happen, depending on the disputes that happen.
Right. I mean, that's really where the difficulties are just maybe insurmountable. It's just sort of, how would you get yourself out of this situation if we actually got to this point? And again, I don't think anyone could say this is likely, but I think the problem is that because of the way we do things, there are certain tripwires, and it is possible that it may be easier to trip over them than in the past. And that's really the challenge in all this, because if you get to Inauguration Day and there's not clarity on who has qualified under the 20th Amendment to be the next president, the 20th Amendment does not lay out how you deal with a dispute over someone having qualified to be president. It just says the person has qualified to be president, will become president at noon and be inaugurated. And it's possible you could have a situation where if there's a dispute over this, maybe President Trump will try to be inaugurated, but Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, will argue, well, the Presidential Succession Act puts the speaker next after the president and vice president in terms of who would accede to the presidency. If no one is in the presidency or the vice president, she would be next. And so she could say, well, fine, we haven't figured out who's president yet, but I will resign my office and become president, like take the oath of office, and serve until Joe Biden is rightfully elected based on the electoral results. And, Republicans probably aren't going to say that's okay, having made the claim that President Trump has been reelected. So this is a quagmire. It can easily devolve into that. Yeah, and if you get to that point, who does the military obey? Who do people in the executive branch, who do they obey? Whose orders are valid? And who gets the nuclear codes? I mean, these are the things that really is like, it's worst case scenario, but the problem is that you could see how it could happen because things are so partisan and so polarized, and you have President Trump raising the existential stakes of the election in such a way that talking about the only way I can lose is if the election's rigged, creating the circumstances where people may be receptive to him claiming that there's fraud in a way that could lead down this road if he can get cooperation from Republican officials in a key state like Pennsylvania in this scenario. And in raising the existential stakes, the effect of that is also to cause Democrats to become even more or just sort of view things in an existential fashion that goes beyond just the simple transfer of power and a fair election result. You will have Speaker Pelosi basically calling President Trump and Republicans in Congress like enemies of the people. It's this sort of rhetoric that's just really, really problematic for trying to sort out an election in a fair and equitable manner.
Yeah, and I sort of want to lead into that too, because you talked about how depending on the scenario, this can be split among state lines, it can be split among state legislatures itself, that it becomes really partisan, that this becomes really mathematical, and that there's lawsuits flying back and forth. But what other sorts of things, especially, Trump as the incumbent president, if he chooses to dispute the results, what does he actually have at his disposal to enforce that dispute and really take this all the way and as far as it can possibly go?
Well, I think he does have, for one thing, a lot of loyalty within the Republican Party. So if you're talking about him trying to encourage officials in important battleground states to sort of go along with claims that he's making, they haven't shown much pushback during his presidency. And so in the interests of trying to retain control of the White House, they might be amenable to going along. And that's again, one of these variables you just can't know unless we get into that situation, which is, disconcerting. Also, the power of the presidency is sizable. And you could potentially have a situation where, okay, we have a disputed election really, really unfolding, and President Trump says, all right, well, there's the protests in the streets about things. There's maybe even violence between partisans. God, that's scary. But that's, if you get into this circumstance, that's the sort of thing you have to be thinking about. Maybe he says, well, as counting's continuing, but there's unrest, he says, well, I'm going to invoke the Insurrection Act and use the U.S. military to try to control the situation. And maybe he tries to do that in a way that's going to benefit him, benefit his chances. Now, in the scenarios that the Transition Integrity Project looked at, when his team tried to do that in their simulation, they did find that Republican officials weren't necessarily going along with that full tilt. So this is one of those things where it's just chance, and how much do certain people go along with actors as they make choices and try to push things in a direction that will benefit themselves. And so would that work for him? Who knows? But he could definitely try it if he really wants to go for it, and try to federalize the National Guard, use that to occupy cities and maybe voting sites. This is the sort of conversation that you get into. And I mentioned earlier, but you also have the Department of Justice. Do they send out federal agents to secure, quote unquote, vote counting sites? It sounds kind of far-fetched, but at the same time, you've had the Department of Justice sending out federal agents against the wishes of local officials to cities around the country in the wake of unrest because of the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis and things that have happened since then. There was federal agents sent out by the Department of Justice. Some of this is very much unlikely, but the particulars are not necessarily that outlandish. President Trump threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act as the unrest was mounting after George Floyd's killing. So it's not totally crazy is basically the problem here.
Yeah, there are 79 days between election night and January 20th, and you've laid out a lot of different scenarios that can happen and different deadlines that could potentially be met. Is there a legal way to ensure that whoever wins the election actually serves as president from 2021 onwards? Is there a legal apparatus that guarantees that very basic thing?
I think the short answer is the courts. But the thing with any court decision and with anything that relies at least in part on norms which unfortunately this involves a lot of norms and people agreeing to disagree at times, is that people have to be willing to go along with those norms and have to be willing to go along with court rulings. And I guess the uncertainty out there is whether things have gotten so partisan and polarized that relying on those norms is still safe. And that's, again, a little troubling. You're not feeling too sure about that these days because things are so partisan and polarized in the country. And the last time we had a dispute was in 2000, and things were ugly then, but things were not quite as polarized as they are now. Al Gore in 2000 could have conceivably tried to carry on his case beyond the Supreme Court decision. That didn't have to be the end of the story, which I think people don't realize, is that I think people view the Supreme Court decision as having been the final reckoning on the matter. But Congress doesn't count the electoral votes until early January, and that Supreme Court decision was in December. Congress could have still considered electoral votes that are considered the counting process and raised the dispute before, that body in early January. And so theoretically, Gore could have carried on. Now, would it have worked out for him? Maybe not, but
he could have done it. His rationale at the time was that he's putting country before self. He didn't want the country to devolve into any kind of mess.
I say to President-elect Bush that what remains of partisan rancor must now be put aside, and may God bless his stewardship of this country.
But again, he's shown reckless behavior. There's no guarantee that he will put country before self in this case.
Yeah, I mean, that's, again, things, we're here 20 years on, and I would say that the climate for country before self is not great at the moment, if you will. And to be fair, like we spent a lot of time talking about President Trump here, and rightly so, because of so many of the things that he has said, and I think he has done the most to provoke concerns about the orderly nature of our electoral process. However, it is entirely possible that a situation could arise where Democrats would sort of reject the legitimacy of the election. If President Trump performs better than he's doing right now in the polls and ends up winning in the Electoral College but loses the national popular vote, there may be Democrats who are basically like, well, this is the third time in 20 years that we have lost in the Electoral College but won the popular vote, and we just can't take this anymore. And you might need more than that to create a true dispute, a true crisis. But I do think that, not that both sides it, but this is not entirely a concern just with Trump and the GOP. But again, this gets back to raising the existential stakes of the election, as President Trump has done, naturally raises how the other side views those existential stakes, and thus creates an environment where it is very possible that both sides would be willing to reject the legitimacy of the election if they think they can win by doing it. And that's the concern, just overall, even beyond just what President Trump has said, which is, worrisome on its own. It's a very disconcerting place to be.
Last question here. There are a huge number of issues, clearly, that we've talked about that concerns the U.S.'s electoral system that predates the Trump administration. That has nothing to do with this administration. We've talked about the Electoral College popular vote split, there's gerrymandering, there's voter suppression. But in your piece for 538, you also make the argument that this is, in essence, a test of America's system of democracy. Does there need to be an independent arbiter in elections? Is that the Supreme Court, which again has been contested before? Like, what should come out of this, knowing that a big dispute could happen?
Right. So I close out my article making the point that the United States does not really have any sort of independent arbiter for an electoral dispute, especially one of this magnitude. In a presidential election. And it might sound weird or even difficult to set up in the first place, especially in the United States right now, things are so polarized. But other countries, I know the United Kingdom actually has a system in place to deal with electoral disputes that does not involve Parliament making choices about the result. We were talking about like Vice President Pence being involved in the counting process when they're figuring out the final result before Congress. There's an obvious conflict of interest there. And really the goal, if you were to try to set up such an institution, would be to try to reduce the conflict of interest possibilities as much as possible. Maybe it's having one Democrat and run Republican. Or even better, maybe, as I didn't really include this in the article, but when I talked to Edward Foley about this, who helped me out a bunch, if you were to have the Republicans pick the Democrat and the Democrats pick the Republican, like both sides make a list, and then the other side has to pick one person from it that they find acceptable enough, and then those two people choose one other person, that 3-person team could form a fairly legitimate, not too compromised arbiter of an outcome that's disputed. That's maybe even stealing a little bit from things like labor relations boards and trying to figure out contractual situations, but having each side pick the other side's person based on a list that's acceptable. Democrats give 10 names and Republicans give 10 names, and then the Democrats pick one Republican from the Republican list, Democrats pick one Democrat from the Democratic list, and you go forward from there. And maybe that's a way to sort things out, but we don't have anything like that. And I know there have been some editorials that have talked about, well, wouldn't it be great if even before the election happened, we had some sort of 3-person board like this, where ahead of time, the campaigns have picked the people that will be on this panel, and that we could just have all this set up well ahead of time in case a dispute arose, and we won't be having to deal with it after the election result is trickling in and as the situation is developing. And so we could be ahead of the game on a potential dispute arising. People who are very tired trying to make decisions and in a very tense situation would have this particular aspect of the dispute already taken care of. And it would be a way to try to come up with the fairest possible result, maybe under difficult and controversial circumstances. So that would be ideal, but we don't have that.
Yeah, this is shaping up to be pretty sticky. We'll see what happens in November. Geoffrey, thanks for helping us make sense of a little bit of this.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And that's Geoffrey Skelley, elections analyst for FiveThirtyEight, on what the fallout of the U.S. election could look like. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Chung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Mudhar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.